Hello and welcome to our panel for day two of NowFest 2020. So to introduce our panelists for today, we have Dr. John Roozenbeek. He is the moderator for today's session, and we absolutely couldn't get enough of him on day one. And we're so happy that he is back for day two, moderating this session on setting up a nudge unit, stakeholder alignment, and accounting for cultural context. Dr. Roozenbeek is a By Fellow in Psychology at Churchill College. His research focuses on online misinformation and the design of interventions to counter the problem at an individual level. Joining him on this panel are some very heavy names, which a lot of us from all over the world are very excited to hear from. Please welcome Fadi Makki, founder of Nudge Lebanon, Qatar Behavioural Insights Unit, and the Consumer Citizen Lab. He is also a member of the World Economic Forum's Council for the Future of Behavioral Sciences, among many other positions. With him, we have Pooja Haldea, co-founder and senior advisor at Center for Social and Behavioral Change at Ashoka University. She's an expert in applied behavioral science and public health, nutrition, and financial inclusion. Then we have Jaya Mahat, a policy economist and director and co-founder of the Nepal Institute of Policy Research with expertise in the area of youth, sustainable development, knowledge management research, and policy advocacy across Asia, Europe, and Latin America. And last but not the least, Neela Saldanha. I am very happy to introduce her because I took her course this summer with Ashoka University on the Introduction to Behavioral Science. So Neela is currently an independent consultant. She was the founding director for the CSBC, the Center for Social and Behavioral Change at Ashoka University, and her work is complemented by rich private sector experience in insight, strategy, marketing in both India and the US. So please take it away, guys.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Am I audible for everyone?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you for having me back. That's very kind. I myself have never set up a nudge unit, so I will not be speaking from experience today, but I do work in academia, at least so long as they haven't kicked me out yet. Last I checked, they hadn't. And I think there's also some interesting overlap between, obviously, behavioral science, nudging, and so on, and academic research. So it will be very interesting, I think, to talk about that part of the way. But the way that I have actually envisioned this talk would be to say, let's have our esteemed speakers talk about the topic of their interests and the topic of the panel discussion for about 10 to 12 minutes each, max 15, I would say. After which we will engage in a bit more of a free-form discussion amongst ourselves. And also after that, we will have time, hopefully quite a bit of time for audience questions as well. So everyone listening in, while you're listening and you're coming up with a question, please let the organizers know. And we will hopefully get to your question, assuming there's not hundreds of them, which will be a bit too much. So the way I wanted to structure this is to let Dr. Fadi Makki go first, then Jaya, then Neela, and then Pooja, if that is okay with you. I think that's more or less what we had agreed, approximately, right? So without further ado, I suppose, Dr. Fadi Makki, please take it away.
Thank you, John, for the introduction. I will share my screen. Is that visible? Are we fine? Right, play. Is that speaker mode? Okay. So thank you, John. Thank you for the organizers for this great conference and event, and great to be with such distinguished panelists and good old friends such as yourself and Neela and a few others. So what I will talk about today is sharing some lessons learned from the setup of behavioral insights and nudge unit in the region, from Lebanon and Qatar in particular, and talk a little bit about a few other instances and say what have we learned over the last 4 or 5 years working in this area. So it's important to just to start saying that what was Qatar Behavioral Insights Unit is now called B for Development. So after a few years of piloting and being incubated in the Office of the Secretary General of the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy in Qatar, the decision was to turn this pilot project of Nudge Unit into a proper foundation with proper legal setup, with expanded mandate, and so on. So we were set up more than 4 years ago to work initially on challenges that the World Cup is facing, Qatar and the region, and that have behavioral roots that we could not deal with using conventional weapons, as it were. You need to inject a better, a more superior understanding of human behavior to be able to address those. So as nudge units were spreading around the world, nothing was happening in Arabia until 2016. So Qatar set up that first nudge unit. Lebanon was immediately after that, where Nudge Lebanon was launched. Both of them kind of working very closely. And then since then, we've seen the number triple and then even more. So now either every government in Arab countries has set up a nudge unit or behavioral science unit, or has started experimenting with behavioral science. So without having yet established a proper kind of structure. So that's very interesting. So it's happening. So behavioral science is really happening. And what I want to share is kind of set of 8 lessons learned, which I will kind of immediately move to and then kind of dwell a little bit on. The first one is how do you decide on the approach when you decide to launch a unit? Start, then announce, experiment, then announce, and so on. So there's this kind of decision, and we will share kind of few specific examples, telling you the pros and cons of those. The second thing is everybody now talks about the need for a champion, someone who would really believe this in government to take that forward. So I would say yes, absolutely. This is very important. However, do not forget the importance of the beneficiary champions, what we call the operational champions, those that will make or break an experiment. So that's something I will talk about. Second and thirdly, initially you need to kind of start with quick wins, with small experiment, pilot experiment, and quickly balance that with more complex set of experiments, but always have a portfolio of kind of dual sets of kind of experiments, the small, the big, the lengthy, and so on. The fourth thing that I will talk about is that experimentation kind of could be applied at 2 levels: at the straightforward policy challenges, and at what we call the layering approach, where you apply pretty much to every challenge, kind of working on different things in it. I'll come to that in a second. Fifth, I will talk about capacity building. So now we're beyond proof of concept. There is more demand for behavioral science, and the only way to do it, to satisfy the needs, is to build capacity at source. So this is very important. I'll talk about this. 6 is basically try to build it early on in strategic planning. 7, build capacity, build communities of practice to bring people from closets who have been educated in behavioral science but don't know where to bring it to bear. So community of practice in every country is very important. And finally, communicate clearly and frequently on what's happening. Even communicate failures and celebrate failures, as we like to call it, but run surveys, understand what the perceptions of people are. So let me move to the first lesson learned, which is kind of in Qatar. What we've done is we launched, so it was announced by the Supreme Committee that we set up the unit, but there's a humongous amount of work to start. I mean, looking at the strategy, looking at the benchmark, what kind of operating model, building the capacity, recruiting a team, which meant that while we launched, we were not ready to experiment before some time, which meant we created a lot of expectations which created a lot of pressure on kind of us to perform and then do kind of show results. And results were not yet to come before building the foundation. What we found in Nudge Lebanon is much more different, is that what we did is actually started with a kind of a bunch of us as researchers working together without yet an institutional structure. So we ran a couple of experiments, the famous one, the electricity de Liban, the traffic, the seat belts, fairly straightforward ones. And then when we set up the unit, we had in our baggage a couple of experiments that we could talk about. So that kind of was very interesting. And Kuwait did something in between. So they got themselves ready. And while they launched, they launched kind of, not before kind of running experiments, but they launched after kind of an initiative, which is a joint course that they did with a university there. So kind of something, they launched with something happening there. So these are kind of some of the approaches one needs to think about, because each one of them has a downside. One needs to manage expectations and so on. The second thing, we always talk about the need for champions, a prime minister, a president, someone in the leadership. It's very important because they will open doors, they create access. So that is extremely important. Someone who is a firm believer in the power of behavioral science, of experimentation, of evidence-based policy making. So this is very important. So yes, I mean, I'm not kind of saying no to this. However, we quickly found out that it's not enough. Even though a minister or kind of someone high up would tell you, I want this, and would direct you to work on this experiment, if the beneficiary ministry with whom you're working is not fully on board, they can kill it then and there. So it's very important to identify those operational champions at the target ministry or entity and work closely with them. And actually, and something that we learned is that go with co-creation. Make sure one mistake we should at any cost avoid. Don't go telling them we want to work and test something at your premises. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is work with them on the challenges, let it come bottom up, and then identify together something that they have access to their data, that's something that is interesting, big priority for them, and then co-create the solution through a set of kind of workshops. So co-creation with identification of operational champions is very important. And as I mentioned, it's very important to start with a small set of experiments, the pilot ones, the micro ones, even at some stage, but quickly balance that with more complex ones. Why it's important to have the small ones and the pilot ones? Because it helps in the narrative. It helps when you're speaking, when you're knocking on doors, talking about behavioral science. Yes, you can talk about the classical one, kind of the social norms in getting people to pay taxes, the salience of messages, the commitment, the default. Yeah, these are important ones, don't get me wrong. But what could be more powerful is talking about fresh experiments that have worked, that are pain points for the policymakers you're talking to. So even if it's small, just showing them how this is done, it helps with the narrative. It helps you kind of build buy-in as such. So always balance quick wins with a set of kind of more complex challenges. The second thing that I want to talk about, we've seen really that kind of you could apply behavioral science to quite a large number of policy challenges, from getting people to eat healthy, to check with doctors, to continue with the protocol of treatment, public finance management, late payers, inclusion, labor, environment, sustainability, plastic education. So really a wide set of policy challenges. And that's basically, you hit it kind of on the head. Really, you dissect the challenge, do the behavior map, and look at the entry point. So fairly straightforward kind of challenge. That's what I call the direct applicability of behavioral science to specific and fairly identified sets of challenges, fairly identified sets of target behaviors that you want to work with. The second level, which could be agnostic to any specific policy challenge, which is really laying what we call putting a layer of behavioral science on top of existing programs to enhance their effectiveness. For instance, to increase mobilization and engagement in a program, to get people to attend the workshop, to be more engaged, and so on. And this is the experiment that kind of famously we work with UNDP in Yemen to work on. It's the big family, of course, is prevention of violent extremism, but it was kind of layering behavioral science on top of a program of psychosocial support to build resilience of youth and vulnerable group against violent extremism and facilitate community self-healing. So the objective was to use BI to generate interest in people, getting people to participate in those workshops, to attend and to be engaged. So that's basically one example where it literally could have been any program where you want to generate interest, get attendance, and engagement. So this is an important kind of layering that we see nowadays very commonly applied. Another thing that we will kind of start seeing is that there's a growing need for capacity building in beneficiary organizations. So, I mean, I remember 4 or 5 years ago when we started, we would be knocking on doors, telling people about the importance of this, and we'd like to work with them. Right now, we have the nice problem of being overwhelmed with more demands. And the only way to satisfy this is to really build capacity at source, at the beneficiary. And the way to do it is to create workshops, to create kind of quick course-style applied courses, and do internships, fellowship, and work with government. So this is going to be very important. And another thing that we always now talk about is really, and I'm very fond of, is the approach that President Obama did 1 year after launching the social science and social and behavioral sciences team at the White House. What he did is like issued an executive order mandating every single government unit to identify policies where BI can improve welfare, develop strategy, recruit BI experts, to literally review their programs from a behavioral lens. It's a mandate, it's an executive order, and ask them to work with that unit. And kind of, this is extremely important. UN is now considering this to be done at the highest level. So, and now a lot of organizations are looking to do exactly this, whereby you streamlining use of BI not as a center of excellence anymore, but literally as a capacity building across a whole set of organizations, and at the country level as well. Another thing, a lesson that is also very important. A lot of our countries in the region and kind of everywhere, they have the strategic planning process. Some of them have councils for that, some of them have ministries, some of them have agencies. The idea is to launch strategic planning, like vision documents, like typically 10, 20 year long, followed by midterm strategy, which is aligned to that, and then followed by operational plans and business plans a year or two or so. So what we've seen is very important, is making sure you introduce behavioral science at the strategic planning early on in the process, so that you really have kind of created the opportunity to bring that early on and affecting those long-term visions and plans, so that when you're aligning with that, you're aligning with behavioral science in mind. So making sure the process is kind of bring that behavioral science in the long term, which will kind of translate into midterm and shorter term strategy. So bringing it earlier on is very important. As I mentioned before, community of practice is very important. And I think a lot of countries now are doing that, which is essentially some kind of an informal network of practitioners and academics of behavioral science. And that is extremely important, because then you share knowledge, you share information on what you're doing, you keep abreast of different findings, you discuss potential collaboration between academia and private sector. You organize events and just do that informally or more formally. And we've seen a lot of those networks kind of mushrooming around the world. And that's extremely important in doing this. BX Arabia we've been doing in Lebanon with the Qatar Behavior development is very important because it brought all the Arab behavioral scientists, practitioners, academics together, and then we do it all the time, kind of in a concerted way. The last point I want to talk about is importance of communicating frequently and use of surveys and actually use experiments with surveys and always update perceptions. And this is one experiment that we did recently in Qatar on the back of a survey. So basically, nowadays we always say, don't miss an opportunity to run an experiment, even when you're running a survey, and literally keep the entire survey the same for both control and treatment, and introduce one kind of treatment condition at the end of one group, just to test something. What we've done here is tested how much people trust to go and speak to mental health consultation services online. And we've been tracking growth in post-COVID-19, a growth in uptake of these services. And what we've seen is that once you tell people, which is the treatment group in that case, that more people are resorting to this, that had a big increase on trust in this. So basically, treated respondents were 1.34 times more likely to score in the higher trust spectrum versus lower ones, equivalent to 34% increase in the odds of highly trusting mental health services. So always, I mean, the big message from this is never miss an opportunity to run experiment, even when you're doing a survey. This is quickly just to show the key components of a successful behavioral science unit. So you need the organizational structure to make it quite defined. You have the team profile, set of behavioral science, communication experts, psychologists, and subject matter expert, public policy, economists, data analysts. So just making sure you have that set. Advisory panel is always very important to have, particularly if you don't have an ethics committee, making sure you work with that. Interagency cooperation, this is very important, kind of if you're a governmental entity, to have that collaboration with other government entities, the community of practice, and link it with academia, which could be at a different level. My concluding remarks, John, is really, yes, I mean, behavioral science is kind of becoming very attractive. There's a big jump on this, but while we talk about the power of behavioral science, we just need to make sure we don't build unnecessarily expectations that could not be met. So we need to always talk about the limitations. So many challenges, yes, they have behavioral roots, but many challenges don't have behavioral roots. And then we need to always think of behavioral science as a complementary set of tools, okay? So in one case, very recently, a very sad case of celebrity shooting. This is very common in Lebanon. We try to work with behavioral sciences that obviously the structural and non-behavioral components are still very powerful. We still continue to work with behavioral science tools, but obviously the lack of enforcement in government, the widespread use of weapons is very strong, and it's not something that could be addressed solely with behavioral science. So the application could be done, as I said, in the layering approach to any defined problem that has behavioral challenges with well-articulated target behavior. When we talk about it, it's about measurable improvement. That's very important to manage the expectation, not necessarily drastic solution. So initially, the main focus was to change the mindset of people to whom you talk to on behavioral science, on the importance to be convinced to work with us. So now we're beyond that. There's this common understanding that behavioral science is very important. We are now into the second wave. We're beyond kind of proofing concept, as it were. we now have to move to the second wave, which is making sure behavioral insights is inclusive, is equitable, and to do this, we need to increase and scale up use of capacity building programs in not only in government, but all the implementation agents that are working in development areas and academia, particularly in a place where a lot of governmental services in conflict zones are kind of disintegrated. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fadi. That was incredibly interesting. There's already a few questions that I can see being very interesting now, and we'll reserve them for later. For now, Jaya, please go right ahead. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Jung. Thank you, Jung. Considering the nature of this event, so I assume that there would be a lot of people and professionals who would be attending or listening to kind of behavioral conference or behavioral science even for the first time, and who may not have very technical knowledge. So I'll try to, so in my session, I'll try to make my content as simple as possible to help them make understand why behavioral science matters in their lives, and how, maybe in their daily lives, they might be seeing a lot of events happening around them without them noticing that, okay, they come from behavioral science. So again, my focus would be on kind of South Asia, considering the rich culture from the region. Basically talking about three different kind of behavioral knowledge. So some of them, they are kind of being used for decades, and they are kind of helping us to have some positive outcomes in terms of policy implementation, and also in terms of other programs. And the second category of behavioral science knowledge I'll be sharing about would represent the knowledge that we have been practicing for centuries, but I think they are rather kind of pushing back the good things that are supposed to happen in our community. And the third category of behavioral knowledge or cultural knowledge that I will be sharing about would represent the emerging cases of knowledge, and that are kind of that are the focus of researchers and scientists around the world at the moment. And again, the first two category of the knowledge, I think, would require a community level effort to implement them, or kind of make them some changes in those knowledge. But the third category of knowledge I will be sharing about would represent the knowledge that can be controlled by the individual itself, or in some cases by the community itself. So just to start the good knowledge that we have been seeing over the decades in our part of the world. So so the incidents of public littering and urination in public are pretty common in South Asia. So if you go to some most of the cities in India, and again in Nepal, so you would see a lot of publicly littered waste around the street. And again, it's very likely that you'll be seeing a lot of people kind of peeing in the public. So again, government in the region, they have tried very hard in the past to control or minimize those kind of incidents. But considering the nature or culture of the region, I think besides government policies, so those kind of initiatives that come from cultures or religions, I think they have proved to be more effective. And I think just to give you a context, right, why these kind of things, they happen to work in this part of world rather than other government policies. So I think we need to see how culture has been embedded in the South Asian society. So there was a pretty good study back in 2010 by Pew Research Institute, and that found that so almost 15% of the global population, so that's a little more than 1 billion people in 2010 were Hindus, and out of them, so 95% of the Hindus, they live in India alone. So that means, and if you go to any part of India, it's very likely that you will be meeting a lot of Hindu people throughout your day. And again, in terms of proportion of Hindu people as compared to the population, so I think so Nepal, Nepal has more than 80% people who follow Hinduism. And again, if you go to India, so in India we have around 79% of the people who follow Hinduism. So the issue of kind of bringing the concept of Hinduism and again linking it to the behavioral sciences, that okay, in the past the government, they have tried their best to control or minimize the incidence of public littering and urination in public, but they hardly worked. But when people started building temples on the roads where public littering used to be pretty common, I think the incidence of public littering suddenly went down. And in addition, in addition, they also kind of began posting photos of God and goddess across the streets to make sure that people do not urinate there. And I think that really has minimized the incidence of urination in public. And practice of these kind of things to minimize public urination and public littering is not only limited to India and Nepal, and even in Bangladesh, I think they have been using these kind of tricks to minimize or solve those kind of issues. So again, just to give you example, right? So why again? I mean, like, so these kind of behavioral knowledge which are driven by cultural factors should be promoted in the region. So I think most of you must be aware of the mega project or multi-billion-dollar project initiated by Modi government when he came to power back in 2014. So I think between 2014 and 2019, they constructed almost 110 million public toilets, investing about 28 billion US dollar. And the major aim of that kind of initiative, which was called Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, was to achieve zero defecation and also kind of minimize the frequent incidents of public urination across different part of India. And last year, on October 2nd, the government of India claimed that by implementing Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and building more than 110 million public toilets, they have achieved their targets. And I think they also declared some of the states and union territories open defecation free. But again, if you read through the critics comments and again the policy researchers comments, so they criticize the government for not being transparent in terms of sharing the outcomes of their entire initiative. And they claim that though the government has built almost 100 million public toilets, but in the village, the government literally forced people to use public toilets. So I think there was no incentive for people to use public toilets. Or by mean, I mean, like, so this, or by that, I mean to say that the government simply wanted to work on its mission rather than understanding what people wanted to follow, or what were the practices or cultural aspect that hindered people from using public toilets. So because of that reason, or the government's failure to incorporate some cultural knowledge or behavioral knowledge or religious knowledge into Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the entire initiative was not able to achieve what it was aiming to achieve for. And the second example is, I mean, like, if you go to Mumbai, the financial capital of India, it's pretty common to see people urinating in the public. So back in 2018 or 2019, few youth who were frustrated with those kind of polluters, they started one pretty cool initiative called pissing tanker. So they literally, I mean, like, they will be going in an yellow water tank, and they will be wearing masks to hide their identity. And if they see anyone peeing in the public, they will be simply make them drown with the water. Though the videos of pissing tanker engaging in those kind of activities became pretty viral on YouTube and other social media, but the real impact of pissing tanker was pretty minimum. And even the critics, they doubt whether those kind of initiative would have any large and long-term impact government policies to minimize public urination events in the country. So my point here is that, so definitely, I mean, like, so if you have a problem, there are multiple ways to solve that one. But considering the nature and religion of a particular region, you need to make sure that you try to incorporate some parts of local religion and culture to rather create some sort of fear for people not to engage in those kind of activities. If uh, if those considerations could be incorporated into the policy making, I think, I mean, like, the policy initiatives aimed at minimizing the incidence of public urination and public littering could be minimized. So let me go to the second type of knowledge, right? So the first type of knowledge that I just finished explaining are some of the knowledge that we have been practicing for decades, but which have been helping us to have some better policy outcomes. And in the second type of knowledge, so second type of knowledge. So we have been witnessing this knowledge uh, for I think centuries. But I think these are some of the cultural and religious knowledge that have rather been further dividing the society. So you can see that, I mean, like, if you go to any temples in South Asia, including in India and in Nepal, you would see it's very likely that those temples would be dedicated for Hindus only. But again, if you go to some religious places of other religion, then those places might be exclusively for the people who follow that particular religion. So by default, so some of the people, they are barred from entering those places, entering those places. And again, if you see the kind of tourism sector in South Asia, including those in India and in Nepal. So we see the federal government and local government, they utilizing those religious and cultural places for tourism activities. But my point here is that if you simply bar people from entering to those places based on their religion, caste, and gender, then how can you promote economic activities at those places? So I think we need to be very mindful of kind of incorporating or kind of changing some sort of cultural factors or religious factors when we are working on particular policies or particular policy targets. And finally, I'll come to the third category of knowledge. So these are pretty recent, and I think many of you have faced or witnessed or practiced them on daily basis. So just to I mean, like, just before going deep into this kind of knowledge, let me highlight some facts which are related to Nepal, right? So in Nepal, back in 1995, there were less than 50 internet users in the country. But recently, as per the government of Nepal's most recent report, so there are more than 22 million internet users or internet subscribers in the country. So that means within 25 years, the overall internet subscriber base has increased by more than 444,000 times. But are we, I mean, kind of using the rise in internet and other technology, and also the growth in internet subscriber for better outcomes? That again is subject of huge debate, right? And again, just coming to my slide. So I think so. I mean, like, so most of the social media and again email service provider platforms, they have been using kind of whatever data that they have to affect or kind of moderate the behavior of the users, right? So if you simply update your status on Facebook, and if someone comments or likes or kind of gives a reaction, then you would be receiving one notification, right? So just imagine that, I mean, like, for 1 week, if you do not update any status on your Facebook or on any other social media, and you do not use I mean, like, you do not comment on others updates, it's very likely that amount of notification that you would be receiving during that week would suddenly go down, right? So that means if you have less notifications, then it's very likely that overall time that you spend on those kind of platform could also be minimized by a substantial level. So the same happens with Google, right? So I think the Gmail has recently started sending a reminder. If you let's say if you have sent an email for a meeting to your colleagues, but you haven't heard back from them for some time, then Google would send you a nudge asking you to resend the email to your colleagues for the event, right? So Google is also using to make you use their services more, and also to accomplish or make your plan work in better ways. And similarly, almost all other social media platforms, including Twitter, be it Instagram, be it LinkedIn, be it TikTok, right? So almost all the internet powered platforms, they have been using people's behavior to better increase their overall user base, for which they have been collecting a lot of data from the users. So my point here is that so my point with this third category of knowledge is that, again, it depends, right? Whether I mean, like whether you are the individual who needs a lot of knowledge in order to accomplish your works, or if you are a professional who rarely needs any knowledge on those kind of platforms to accomplish your activities. So it all depends on individuals whether they have to use more knowledge or not. And for that reason, all the internet platforms, they allow you to customize the amount of notification or amount of knowledge that you would be receiving each time or each day. So the final.
I'm very sorry to interrupt very briefly. We are kind of running a little bit out of time.
Okay.
Would you mind wrapping up?
Yeah, Zona, I'm done. So the final one is kind of the courtesy of the photos, right? So I'm done. Again, if you have questions, I will jump in later on. Thank you, Zona.
Thank you very much. Okay, wonderful. Thank you kindly for the presentation. Next is, I believe it's Neela.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've already learned so much by being on this panel, so it's really great. I'm not going to take up too much time. I want to bring a slightly different perspective to setting up nudge units or behavioral science units in organizations, and that really comes from my private sector experience and then the development sector experience that I had. So to give you a little bit of background about me, I started out as a marketer. So I come from to behavioral science in a slightly unusual way, in that I'm a marketing person, got my MBA, worked in consumer packaged goods in marketing, got a PhD in marketing, which turned out to be thinly disguised behavioral science. And then joined again another marketing company post my PhD before getting into development. And so I just want to talk about some of the lessons that I learned. Some of those have been very ably represented, so I won't take up too much time. So let me, without further ado, actually share my screen. I just have 6 pictures. Hopefully that would, we all know in behavioral science that pictures are more vivid than words. So I'm going to try and use some of those principles here. So when I first started out, I got my PhD and I thought I had discovered the Holy Grail. This was it. This was going to, end world poverty in 6 pence. This was the solution to life, the universe, and everything. And I went into this really great marketing organization and I said, everybody should know about behavioral science. And really went in there and was trying to evangelize and doing that for months. And people would be, that's really interesting. But I discovered sort of the first lesson of my life when trying to set up something new and something around behavioral science, which is that nobody cares. Okay, so like those of you who recognize Lamar Jackson, American footballer, I wish I had worn that T-shirt. It really is that nobody cares. And they don't care because, in the organization, because they were stupid or because they didn't understand. These are a bunch of very smart people who really cared about their product and customer and business. The reason they didn't care was because I didn't make them care about behavioral science. So I was starting with this lovely golden hammer that I had, and I was looking for nails all over. And people are actually saying to me, well, I don't need the nail. I don't need your hammer. I need to figure out how to put up this painting. And so that really set me with the first lesson when setting up these kinds of units or trying to get behavioral science into an organization is you don't start with behavioral science, you start with the problem. And I think Fadi put it well when he said there are some problems that may not even be amenable to implementing nudges of behavioral science, or that might not be the primary thing because there are structural issues, there are other issues. So I think if you start out with this idea that nobody cares, you're much more inclined to think about who your customer is, why they should care, why behavioral science is actually a good solve for their problem, and much more likely to think about the problem. And that was my first sort of lesson when I started thinking about what the business problem to solve was. And later on, when I founded CSBC, what the problem to solve is in nutrition or health, then you get a sharper view of what behavioral science can do to solve that problem. And that's really critical. So the second lesson I had was, again, so I got a little bit of this and was talking to people. I had a good plan, I thought, required some budgeting, etc. And I made this plan and I presented to everyone. And I remember meeting with a senior leader in the organization. And she went through the plan and everything. And she said, that's great. Is it in our annual planning process? And I said, oh, I don't even know when your annual planning process is. And she said, well, if it's not in the annual planning process, it doesn't go into our budgets. If it doesn't go into our budgets, it doesn't get done. And that really taught me lesson number 2. Whether you're Trevor Noah or whether you're trying to set up a behavioral science unit in an organization, timing is everything. Okay, so you really want to understand, and this was even more critical, I think, when I went to set up the Center for Social and Behavior Change, and you're working with government, you will not get anything to scale unless it is in the government planning processes. So you've got to understand the organization that you're implementing behavior science for, understand their planning process, understand how to get in there, and only then you can actually be in the organization. So my third lesson really is, I love this painting by René Magritte, and it says, this is not a pipe. And for years, I was very puzzled because this is exactly a pipe. So I wondered why he said this was not a pipe. But I realize now, and the reason he says this is not a pipe, because it is not a pipe. It is the drawing of a pipe. It's the representation of a pipe. It's not a pipe. What does this have to do with behavioral science? Telling people about behavioral science is not behavioral science. And this was, again, another lesson I learned, and I think Fadi has talked about it as well. So when I first joined the organization, I was trying to tell people all about behavioral science, and that's great. You have to spread awareness, but eventually the discussions would fizzle out. So what we decided one day, we had a partnership with the Yale Center for Customer Insights, is to just run a few experiments. And as Fadi put it, just run those simple experiments and show people rather than tell them. And so we found some people in the food service area to run some of these experiments, and we got some interesting results. And the next time someone said, well, how can this apply to my business? I said, well, let me show you a little bit of what we've done. And when they saw that, they were completely convinced. And then it became less of the tell me what the practical value is and more of the how can I do this? Similarly, when we were at CSBC, and Pooja can talk about this a lot more, is we were trying to figure out how to convince people to get on board with behavioral science. And we decided rather than do that, let's just run some experiments around a particular project area, which in that case was how do you get pregnant women to take iron and folic acid supplements to combat anemia. And so we partnered with the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and we just ran those experiments. And more than anything, I think that's been most useful in trying to give people a sense of what is an experiment, how do you run it, what is an insight, what do you mean, how is this different from communication and marketing and all these questions that people have. So the next time I would say, show, don't tell. That's my sort of third lesson. The fourth one, and Fadi has said this really well, is keep it simple. So when we first started out, when I was doing this in the private sector, I was so enamored with these amazing subtle experiments. I was trying to do something. I said, just changing wording or something like that is too simple. I was trying to do something really subtle. And obviously those experiments did not work. And I think it really came down to the keep it simple. And one related aspect to the timing that I talked about was you also want to find existing touch points. When you're trying to set up something new, you don't want to set up different platforms as well to do that. We were trying to set up some experiments, and we first thought we would go to the retailer, get an agreement with them, get them to set up some model shops, run the studies. And that itself was such a difficult process. Instead, we started to look around and say, what can we do to run experiments? What are the consumer touch points? One of those was food service. Another one was maybe our e-commerce site. And once you start thinking about what those touch points are and keeping it really simple, then you will find that, you can run those experiments. So that's much, much easier to do. Keep it really simple. I won't belabor this point, this learning, because I think every one of us needs, somebody like Malala's father who sort of champions the behavior science work. I just want to say that, so I've been doing this for a few years at the organization, and, given presentations to everyone, right from CEO downwards, and things were happening, but they were a little slow. And then one day I got a call from one of the heads of the business units, and he said, this behavior science thing, what is it exactly? Can you tell me? And I said, great, I have this proposal and I'll send it to you. And it turned out it was end of year. He had a little bit of extra money and he said, can we try something with this? And that was it. He was the champion. He was not from where I would have expected a champion to be. So he was not a marketing person. He was not an insights person. He was actually a business leader. But actually it turned out to be much better than having a champion from my own department. So not only do you want to look at, and I completely agree with having operational champions as well as leadership champions, but you might want to look at champions who don't necessarily, who don't know about behavioral science, but who know about their business. And at CSBC, one of the biggest champions was one of our trustees who actually knew a lot about his work and just learned behavior science as we were talking about it. And that really makes for a good champion. My final point, and these are all points that I think are lessons that can be translated, whether you're setting up, in the US of A, whether you're setting up a behavioral science unit in the private sector, or whether you're trying to set up a unit with the government in India. So, we are more similar than we are different in some sense. My final point, which I keep championing, especially in terms of, and seeing Jaya's presentation, in terms of the cultural context, is that, it's really essential, and Fadi's talked about it, that I think if we have to succeed, particularly in the global South, where 80% of the world lives, is that it's really important we have partnerships, but not just with well-known nudge units in the global North where behavior science is established, but with the South. So for those of you who can see the slightly blurry picture, my friends in South Asia, you will think that it's a samosa and you will be almost right, but it's actually not a samosa, it's an Egyptian sambusa. And Ethiopian sambusa, and there's the Uzbek samsa. And I spent all my life in food, and I'm fascinated by how food travels across borders. And this is just to say that we often share elements of cultural context, particularly in the global South, that can really lead us to accelerate our own partnership. So, I would be very interested after this talk to link up with Jaya and find out what work they've done in Nepal and see how, we can do this kind of work. And so I would really advocate for that sort of South-South partnership and community building in order to learn about this. So those are essentially sort of my lessons about setting up a behavioral science unit. Start from the position that nobody cares, figure out, the timing, show, don't tell, make it really simple, find your champion who may not necessarily be from your department. And, my plea and my request to sort of really accelerate South-South partnerships if we want to have behavior science, spreading across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neela. That was very insightful. last up, before we move to questions, discussions, etc., Pooja, cordially invited to enlighten us.
Thanks so much. So good evening, everyone. Firstly, thanks for having me on this panel. We in India are still very new in our journey to setting up a nudge unit. So it's really great to connect and learn from other practitioners, people like Fadi and Jaya, who've been doing this for a while, and of course, Neela, who I've worked very closely with. So I work with the Center for Social and Behavior Change, which is a part of Ashoka University. It's the largest liberal arts university in India and set up with a grant from the Gates Foundation. Now, the mission of this center is to use behavior science to improve policy and programs, especially those aimed at low-income populations in India. And we do this across sectors, health, nutrition, sanitation, financial inclusion, and more recently, even data privacy. Now, we are also leading the effort to set up the first ever nudge unit within the Indian government. This is within NIPoRe, which is India's policy think tank. Actually, it's not called a nudge unit. It's called a Behavioral Insights Unit, and BIU, and more on why that is will come a little later. So in the 10 minutes that I have, I don't have any slides. I will just talk about three things. First, what is this Behavioral Insights Unit supposed to do? What's the mandate? Second, what has been our approach? And then third, share some early learnings that we've had. So coming to the first thing, what is the BIU supposed to do? The mandate of the BIU is to improve certain chosen indicators, certain metrics for what are called aspirational districts. These are around 115 districts representing around 20% of India's population, and they are spread across the country. And these districts are among some of the worst performing on many socioeconomic indicators. As a part of this aspirational district program, the government tracks 49 indicators in these districts every 3 months. These range from health to education to infrastructure. So you already have a very regular stream of data on them. Now, to start with, the BIU has picked up 5 indicators, and these are focused on maternal and child health. These include things like what Neela was mentioning, which is, how do we tackle anemia by making sure pregnant women take the iron supplements, ensuring that women register their pregnancies early in the system, they complete their antenatal care visits, completion of first-year immunization for children, complementary feeding, our children from 6 months plus, are they getting adequate diet beyond breast milk, and so on. Now, why these indicators? Well, there was a lot of to and fro, a lot of discussion on which indicators we should choose, and it came down to 3 reasons. Firstly, these indicators are to some extent less dependent on supply, so there is more scope for behavior science to have impact. A lot of these indicators have been very hard to move using more traditional methods, and then of course, these are very important. Now, as you can imagine, moving these indicators isn't easy. These are not the low-hanging fruits that Fadi was talking about earlier. A lot of these health indicators haven't moved because of generations of social norm, entrenched practices, which can be very hard and slow to change. So in effect, we are working in the worst performing districts, trying to change behaviors deeply entrenched in the communities. And moreover, we are doing this with very hard to reach populations. Many of them don't even have access to TVs, forget phones or smartphones. We can't just send them emails with slightly, differently framed messages and expect anything to change. So to the first part of today's topic about context, our contexts are very different from the US or the UK and other weird countries. The problems we are trying to solve and the populations we are working with are very different. And while behavioral principles may travel across geographies, it is quite difficult to be able to find interventions which we can just plug and play. So of course, context matters a lot. So that was about the mandate of the BIU. Now coming to how are we working on these indicators? So we put in place a process. It's still evolving, of course. The current process is we start with defining the problem sharply. So the government's objective may be, reduce anemia, but we will narrow it down to specific behaviors, saying, how do you get women to take their iron supplements during pregnancy, which is one behavior which will help counter anemia. And that's, we're talking about 180 tablets. So after defining the problem, we get into the diagnose phase. Here we are looking into behavioral barriers, we're looking at facilitators, looking at existing literature, secondary research, and then you come up with a list of intervention ideas. And these range from communication ideas to changing incentive structures, to product and packaging ideas, to using defaults more effectively. And from there, you then move to the design phase, where prototypes are created for each of these ideas, and then to the test phase, where these prototypes are tested in a lab or a lab in the field setting. And of course, we keep optimizing the ideas based on what we learn. And then finally, you run a field pilot in a couple of districts to see what does it really take to make an intervention work in real life condition using existing government machinery. Final deliverable is a scale-up plan that you can hand over to the districts, which they can then implement. And this actually leads to the second part of today's topic, which is stakeholder engagement. Because to get anything adopted in even one small district of India, and there are 739 districts, it requires engagement right from the top to the field level, from the central ministries to the state governments to the district officials and then the frontline workers, sometimes even the village level influencers who can make or break implementation. Now, everyone needs to feel ownership and excited, and frankly to us, this stakeholder engagement is the most critical part of making the unit successful, more than the specific idea or any experiments that we run. So we see that as a very critical role of the unit about how do we aid adoption of interventions of behavior science in the field. Now, many questions remain, which we will have answers to as we do more work, but some initial learnings that I'd like to share. Nudging is about closing intent to action gap, and Cass Sunstein puts it very nicely. Nudge is like a GPS. You know the destination and the nudges help you get there. But in developing countries, creating intent itself is a very big objective. It's not just about closing the intent to action gap. And here is where we get into the realm of marketing and advertising, the role of campaigns, and especially mass media, which can give instant scale. That becomes important. Now, private sector has done a great job over the decades, convincing us that we need their products, that is creating intent through marketing, through advertising. So in a sense, our nudge unit can't just focus on nudges. We also need to be good marketers. We need to learn about advertising. And this is also one of the reasons we decided to call ourselves the Behavioral Insights Unit as opposed to the narrower nudge unit, because a lot of the work we end up doing is about using behavior science to create the intent. So that's learning one, that mass media and advertising is an important tool, and we need to learn how to create it, deploy it, and measure it. A second related learning is the importance of design and having good design skills in-house. Why? Because in the initial work, building buy-in is critical, but governments don't get excited by ideas on paper. It needs to be real, something that you can touch and feel. So you need a design team which can very quickly convert ideas from literature, from your diagnosis phase, to contextually relevant prototypes using visuals and languages that speak to the target audience. So that's learning too, that you need to have good design skills which can contextualize ideas and make them real. The third learning is that when you're solving a problem, it's often not just confined to nudging the end user. In the case of, for example, the IFA, the Iron Supplement Project, it's not just about the pregnant woman. Often our work leads us to using behavior insights for the entire value chain. So there's a pregnant woman, there's the frontline worker who counsels her, the medical practitioner who provides health service, and even the government administration which makes all of this happen. So the scope of what we have to nudge, who we need to move, needs to be seen more broadly. Fourth learning is that a focus is needed on optimization, not on innovation. The government cares about moving indicators on the ground, and they don't care, and frankly shouldn't care, about academic papers or how brilliant our idea is. Often it takes much more sense to tweak and optimize what exists than coming up with something new. And these tweaks are also much easier to scale up. An example would be adding just 2 simple standardized lines to the counseling that frontline workers are already giving pregnant women. Something as simple as XYZ are side effects, so don't get surprised if you experience them. Take the pill right before you sleep, a very simple timing cue, which we believe can increase adherence. So you're optimizing, you're tweaking rather than adding to the system's burden. And that's very critical. So that's learning number 1, learning number 4 for us. We need to constantly try to tame that instinct that we have to come up with something new, bright, and shiny. And then lastly, Decision cycles for governments are short. Everything is needed as of yesterday. And then often what suffers is collecting evidence. There's never time to run experiments. So we've been trying to find the right balance between RCTs, which academics run on one hand, which can take multiple years, often too long for the government, to the other extreme where there's no evidence or there's only very anecdotal evidence because there's no time. So we're trying to see how can we do more robust lab and lab in the field studies using proximal outcomes, playing behavioral games to gain evidence rather than full-blown field RCTs. We have a mobile lab. It's a bus refitted with computers that we can actually take to the field to run studies. So figuring out the right proximal outcomes that can A, be tested quickly, and B, can predict real life behavior, that's another capability that would be critical if we want to have timely impact on the ground. So as I said, many questions still remain, and I'm going to talk about 3 big questions that we are currently struggling with, and then I'll close. So first is that we want to move indicators, but often behavior science is only part of the answer. There are supply side issues, there are policy related issues, there are systemic issues. And one of the questions we are trying to solve is that how do we as a behavior science unit work meaningfully with other parts of the government to collectively solve the problem? The second is that, there's a question around, of course, and I've talked about this, so I won't repeat it, around the stakeholder engagement and excitement. How do we really get it from top to the bottom? Because the number of stakeholders are many. And last but not the least, there's a question around funding. Because testing and implementation costs are very substantial in India. It's all offline, it's rarely digital, and it requires physical changes, it requires trainings on the ground, production of material, infrastructure. And so who and how we fund these efforts is not a trivial question. So to close, on many days, what we are trying to do seems impossible. We ask ourselves, can we really use behavior science to solve some of the biggest challenges this country of 1.3 billion people face? But at the same time, the scale and scope of this is very exciting. It's not been tried anywhere else in the world at this scale, so it keeps us motivated. There's a long way ahead, and what makes a difference, of course, is that we have a lot of support from NIPoRe, from the government, and I'm looking forward to the next few years and this exciting journey that we've started in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pooja. That was great. So we have about 20 minutes left, I think. So I want to do one brief discussion, basically about what I mentioned earlier, that has to do with the involvement of academia. After which it's good to move to the audience questions, I think. Well, we'll see how that goes. Anyway, so this is a question, right? Like I think Pooja mentioned this just now quite briefly, but it's a very interesting point. It's useful to work with academia, I suppose, because academics are trained in conducting randomized control trials and making sure that you're actually measuring what you're trying to measure, let's say behavioral change, right? Like, which are obviously very complicated questions. Do you really have to work with academic institutions, or is it enough to work with people with an academic education or any education that allows them to know how to conduct these trials? Or I guess more broadly speaking, the question I'm asking is, what is the value of working with academic institutions and people who work as academics, let's say professional academic scientific researchers? And that question is open to all, so whoever wants to weigh in can, if they want to.
If I may just add just a few thoughts here, John. It's a great synergetic value proposition for all. So government or anyone outside academia, whether the unit is set up in government or as a foundation, NGO, and so on, they have access to information. They have access to real stakeholders. They have access to real challengers. On the other hand, academia has access to a pool of students, campus-related challenges, and expertise, which kind of is not always matched to work on the real-life challenges. So kind of by itself, just offering to work with academia, bring the best in both, what everyone, kind of the comparative advantage, what each one can focus best on. Plus academia role in ethical review is so important to give that kind of cachet of approval for kind of the behavioral experiment, to make sure that culture kind of working, kind of crediting consent, making sure kind of this is done with the highest level of ethics is important. So it's really synergetic. But there's a lot of adjustment on both hands, because on one hand, academics are used to kind of long-winded research. In policy and government, you cannot afford to do that. I mean, you could, as I said, balance the portfolio, have a kind of put on one track the long-winded one, but on the other hand, you need to work on kind of quicker cycle of experimentation, and that is starting to happen.
I just want to add that I completely agree. So I think the value of academia I've seen so far interacting with academics is that this is the only bunch of people who are constantly just thinking about this. This is what they're paid to do. This is what they're researching. So if you really want to find out what the cutting edge is on behavioral science, you have to go to the academics. It's almost impossible. It's been 10 years since I got my PhD, and I'm already out of date with understanding what the latest is. So I do think it's really critical, but I do agree that getting them on directly on a project is not often the best solution for all parties. What I find very useful is having some sort of translator, somebody who understands both academia and practice, to be able to take the best of both worlds and say, okay, this is how we're going to use these ideas, but in a way that actually makes sense. And I would say in the creation of a nudge unit, having a couple of those translators is really critical to make sure that you are getting the best of both worlds, and it's a synergy and not a clash, and not something where you throw out the baby with the bathwater.
So I think there is no harm in collaborating with academic institutions for whatever research activities that you plan to carry out, right? But again, I think engaging academic faculties on full-time basis or kind of on non-residential basis would depend on overall scope of your research, I think. So if it involves kind of reforming some educational aspect of that particular policy, I think in that case, I mean, like having someone to work full-time would be a pretty good idea. But if you are planning to rely on an academic professional for carrying out some research activities only, in that case, I think having someone to work on part-time basis or hiring someone for research assistantship would suffice your requirement.
Yeah, I mean, I think all the points have been made, and agree, especially with Neela's point about translators, which sit between academics and, especially the government. And what, I also realize maybe I'm the only non-PhD on this panel. Okay. Good to have company. So, for us, actually, what happens is that having academics in the mix creates some sort of tension in the system, which I think is good, because on one hand, the government is wanting you to do everything very, very quickly. And then, the academics, they want to bring in rigor. And I think that opposing tension in the unit, I think that's very beneficial.
Yeah. And just one last point in closing, not all academics are the same. So I think there are some we worked with who are, who I would say are even more wanting to get to solving a problem quickly than even non-academic professionals. They really are like, oh God, why are you guys so slow? And I'll send something to them, and next morning you'll get a response. And very practical and able to talk at that level. There are other academics who are much more, shall we say, well, academic for want of a better word, I think. And, if you say, okay, let's do a literature review, then it would take them like a year to do that, right? Because they want to do it really carefully and correctly. And they're both good. So all of these are top-notch academics. But I think it's the question of which ones do you partner with? And so you always want to look out for academics who are very interested, and you can make out by the way they ask you about your question, the way that they have you talk about the question, which ones are interested in your problem. And it comes down to what I said, even when you're setting up, it's not about the content, it's about the problem. And so ones who start with the problem first are more likely, I think, to have a better partnership with than those who sort of start with content first.
Yeah, that's a very interesting discussion. From my perspective, I actually really agree with Neela that there are quite a few academics who are also quite frustrated with academia in general, meaning like we're fully aware that like why should something take 2 years, like when you spend a year and a half just writing up all the literature that's been written about it, only doing your own little sort of tiny little experiment that contributes like a minuscule amount to the existing literature. Like people are frustrated with that. Obviously, that's not how all of academia works all the time, but that's one of the things that people might run into. So there's this willingness, I would say, to also engage more with practitioners. But then what I imagine is the case is that sometimes as an academic, you run into things like feeling pressure to do things more quickly than you might like. And also you're seeing your own role as like having to implement or enforce a level of, let's say, scientific rigor within certain organizations because you feel that they are being ignored or that people are jumping over the fact that, you know, proper testing and validation is necessary before you launch anything, really. It's one of those things that I guess is just unavoidable when it comes to these kind of partnerships. So that's perhaps it's even a good thing. One other thing, sorry, Fadi, go ahead.
Just one thing to add. I mean, this relationship with academia, I mean, brought a lot of changes on both hands. We learned so much from them, the rigor and so on, and they're learning to adjust as well. One of the things that I'm seeing kind of changing but needs more, I don't know whether the panelists see that, is the need more in academia than anywhere else, the need to celebrate failures, to kind of be fine with the idea that failures are part of the test learning and adapting. And I don't know where to create that kind of pressure, which button to trigger to kind of get more willingness to publish failed experiments, not only just successes as such. So that's, I thought, is also very important because we really have a big logo saying celebrate failures. We learn just as much from that.
I fully agree. Sorry, please go ahead, Neela.
I couldn't agree more. I think that, you know, it's a longer conversation about how do you actually encourage that culture in academia so that you can then move faster into practice. Sort of, it's not related, and maybe I can speak after you've spoken, John, but I think one of the other things is that you own the problem if you are the practitioner. Do not outsource the problem solving to the academic, right? It's not the job of the academic to solve your problem. The job of the academic is to provide expertise that you want to help you solve your problem. And in the private sector, I make this analogy to a brand manager. The job of the brand manager is to really make sure market share increases by sort of like the conductor of the orchestra, making sure different people do different things and they all do it well. So there's the innovation department, the R&D department, the communications, the advertising, the sales and marketing department. And then there is the conductor who's sort of the brand or category manager. I would say think of yourself as the brand manager of your problem. You know, you are the one who's orchestrating this conductor, and your academic might be your first violinist, but like is at the end of the day part of your orchestra. The academic is not the conductor. And that's the way often that you can get to, I think, using and really leveraging that expertise without it overwhelming your entire project.
Yeah, very interesting discussion. Yeah, basically you already said what I was going to say, Neela, so there's no need for me to weigh in on this anymore. One thing that I think that is a little bit more of a philosophical discussion perhaps and less practical, but then again, I am an academic, so, you know, forgive me, is the following thing. I think Fadi alluded to this basically at the beginning of his presentation. Let's say behavioral insights, nudging, and so on are quite popular among governments, as we all know, and other powerful institutions that, you know, have the ability to introduce these kinds of things. But isn't there a risk, let's say, and how big is that risk, of behavioral insights being seen as a solution rather than a tool? Meaning, how do you prevent, let's say, a government that you're working with from thinking, well, we've done behavioral insights, so the problem's solved, let's say. I was wondering what your experiences are in that regard.
I mean, I'll just say just one thing. I love the anecdote or the example that Neela mentioned on kind of having a hammer, which is the behavioral science weapon, and looking for a nail. And this is kind of so true, but we should lose sight of the fact that where is the challenge, where is the problem, and start from the problem up front. So I think that this is kind of very important. We need to kind of work with more policymakers on capacity building. I mean, as I mentioned, they're sold on the idea of now, yes, the power of behavior science is there. Like everybody, as I said, in the Arab world, at least, and more in developing countries, either is setting up a unit somewhere or experimenting with this. But what's going to have to happen is to kind of scale it up, streamline it inside government agencies. I mean, doing mandates such as what President Obama did, but introducing it earlier on in the civil service so that you cannot graduate from civil service school and go to government without having an idea about behavioral science, about experimentation, because that's the only way to scale it up. And then you need to guard against misuse of that. I mean, but it's a problem. It's a real problem. Misusing behavioral science is something we should all worry about. That's why we should have more kind of communities of practice, ethics, codes of conduct. I think as Sansu's been talking a bit about this. So this is extremely important as we see the greater adoption of behavioral science. That's my kind of 2 cents.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, you know, the first question, I think it is quite important, especially, you know, in India, when we look at the problems, to first be very clear about, you know, which problems you want to work on, where you actually think behavior science can have an impact, because there are a large number of problems which are much better solved through policy or, you know, supply side fixes. So, you know, as I talked even in my, we did spend a lot of time trying to first just choose the right indicators, because not every problem has behavior science's solution. But even in these problems, you know, whenever we actually go back to the government, and this is something we learned the hard way, we always, you know, in our diagnosis and our recommendation have 3 buckets. I mean, we're like, okay, this is what is you need on the demand side and on, you know, the behavior science. These are some policy recommendations, the policy that needs to be changed. And then here is what needs to be fixed on the supply side. So, you know, presenting that entire picture and not just going with one part, which initially we were going, you know, going with just the behavior science answer, but not really sort of also making that diagnosis and recommendation more comprehensive. And then, of course, lastly, I think to just start talking about behavior science not as you know, a solution, but like series of experiments and series of trials and many things that you're going to try, and all of them are going to make you know, a little bit you know, change on the ground, but it's not that, and so therefore getting into that mindset of many things that you're going to try versus you know, what's the one big idea which is going to solve you know, anemia in India. So I think keeping, you know, reminding the government as well that it is just one part of many other things that need to be solved, and that even that one part is many micro things, you know, that helps, and it needs to be reinforced.
And I do think that we have been guilty of this a little bit as well, right? Because we keep talking about, you know, behavioral science like it's the second coming, and really hyping it up. And I do agree with what Fadi said, and even Pooja made an important point about mindset. I think what we need to do is to cultivate a behavioral science, or have everybody cultivate a behavioral science mindset. And, you know, when I was in consulting, one of the things that a measure of success was when your client did not even know and did not reference you at all, and did not say X consulting firm did it, but say we did it. And I would almost like to see that in behavior science, where people don't actually say this is a nudge, but they're almost talking naturally about it, and they're thinking about it. And for that, I completely agree with Fadi. You need much more capacity building awareness so that everyone's sort of educated about the basic concepts, and then they can take this toolbox and then they can apply it. Because if they're going to see this new tool, which they don't know anything about, they're going to rely on someone else to do it. And then it's never just going to become internalized. So I think part of this is making it part of the culture. And rather than say we are doing behavioral science, is to say we are cultivating a behavioral scientist mindset, which is constant experimentation, drawing from the literature, evidence-based work, not necessarily just, you know, implementing some cool nudge that we've all heard about.
Yeah, so just to add one more point to John's question, Zone's question. So I think again, I mean, like, so in the conditions when politicians commit too many things to deliver to their voters during election, I think it's very likely that in those kind of situation, politicians themselves, they might end up using this behavioral insight tool as a result to prove in front of the people that they have done something good, right? But again, as Pooja has mentioned earlier, behavioral science experiments involve a series of events, right? So let's say, I mean, like, one particular event results in a good thing, the second and third one may not yield the desired ones. So the politicians, they might engage in cherry picking and try to only take credit for the good things that have happened because of those experiments.
All right. Thank you all very much. I think that that concludes. We're right about on time. I think 3:30 in the UK, a bit later in India. Yeah, thank you everyone. That was really engaging. I thought it was great. Unfortunately, we didn't have time for audience questions, but I'm sure the organizers will be happy to pass out contact details, perhaps if necessary, assuming everyone here agrees to it. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going. So thank you all very much. And also thanks to the organizers for putting this together and putting this panel together with all these speakers. So thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Great seeing you all.
Thank you so much, John, Pooja, Neela, Fadi, and Jaya.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
What a wonderful panel, what a wonderful discussion, and what a shame we were not able to take questions from the audience.
Yeah.
But still, we such a life, and we are under a time constraint. And we'll find a way to communicate these questions to you. Once again, on behalf of all the audiences, thank you so much for joining us out here and enlightening us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Prakash and team, for doing everything possible.